All right, this week is week 6 in A&P2, and we only have 3 systems left. This week we are doing the digestive system, urinary will be next week, and then the last week we'll have the reproductive system. So this week, part 1, we are going to talk about something called the alimentary canal. The digestive system is split up into one long tube in which food travels and interacts with those structures directly. And then there's also a set of accessory organs, and those accessory organs don't necessarily see the food stuffs directly, but they do secrete enzymes and things like that to help digest those materials in the alimentary canal. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on the alimentary canal. In part 2, we'll focus on the accessory structures. And then part 3, we'll talk about the physiology. All right. So just a little bit about digestion. So digestion is the chemical and mechanical breakdown of food into forms that cells can absorb. So the point is to eat food and extract nutrients from that food so that our cells can utilize those nutrients to form energy as ATP with those nutrients. So things that can be absorbed are going to be amino acids, which come from the breakdown of proteins. Fatty acids come from the breakdowns of fats or lipids. Glucose is going to come from the breakdown of carbohydrates. Also, we have vitamins, minerals, and of course, water. All of those things are simple forms of much bigger structures that our digestive system is responsible for breaking large things down into so that our cells can use those nutrients. So like I kind of mentioned, the alimentary canal is basically the GI tract from the mouth all the way to the anus. So this is one long tube. So from the mouth, down the throat, down the esophagus, into the stomach, and then throughout the intestines, and then excrement. That's going to be all the primary alimentary canal. The accessory organs are going to be structures that are located in or nearby the alimentary canal that helps to do a task of digestion of breakdown. So for example, in your mouth, we have salivary glands throughout the mouth that help with digestion. The liver here, the gallbladder is here, the pancreas would sit about right here. And you can kind of see it right here. It's going to be behind the stomach. But essentially those things are all situated around organs of the alimentary canal, but food doesn't actually go through the liver, the gallbladder, or the pancreas. Those things all are going to secrete substances to help in digestion, however. How do things move through the alimentary canal? So of course, you eat food, you can swallow that food. What happens then? So there's a lot of mixing and propelling movements that happen throughout the digestive tract. So here in the stomach, we have this mixing, this churning action here. The stomach is very muscular, which we'll talk about. But basically the stomach is squeezing from all directions here. And then those substances are squeezed through into the next section of the alimentary canal, which would be at the beginning of the small intestine. Segmentation is another way things can move. So for here, we have a contraction happening in the smooth muscle of the wall. And then here's the contents here. And as we squeeze proximal to that food substances, that bolus moves more distally throughout the canal. Peristalsis is one thing that, actually, these are out of order. This is mixing, this one's segmentation and this one's peristalsis. So segmentation's over here in part B. So basically what you have here is you have material digesting with kind of like pinched off sides here. And then there's going to be contraction of those substances in the middle as well as on the sides to kind of help mix it in segments, essentially. But here's going to be your peristalsis. This is the movement that I am most concerned that you know. This is where things are moving due to smooth muscle contraction. Now note that these movements are all going to be involuntary after swallowing occurs. So you don't control how things move through your stomach or your intestines. These movements are all responsible for that. This one again is peristalsis. So this is where you have the smooth muscle contraction proximal to the food bolus, and then that moves throughout the digestive tract. This happens most frequently in the intestines. So in the alimentary canal, we start with the oral cavity. So you eat the food, the pharynx, we talked about that in, last week in the respiratory tract. So again, there's that shared throat area before the split comes between trachea and esophagus. But since we're talking about digestive tract, we don't want to go down the trachea this time. We're going to go down the esophagus. The esophagus leads to the stomach, which then opens to the small intestine, then the large intestine, and finally rectum and anus, which is where excrement happens. So let's start with the mouth. So in the mouth, the majority of mechanical breakdown happens. Chewing is also called mastication. That's the physiological word for chewing. So our teeth, right? Those are mostly responsible for that action, breaking down large food pieces into smaller components. Now, there is some chemical digestion that begins here because of the salivary glands, but the salivary glands are going to be an accessory organ, and therefore we'll talk about that in part 2. The cheeks are here to kind of keep the food contained. The tongue, same thing, moving that food around so that the proper teeth can break it down. The palate separates the oral cavity from the nasal passages, actually. So that is why we are able to breathe while we chew food. And then, of course, our teeth. Evolutionary wise, we have a mixture of kind of sharper teeth and molar type teeth, grinding teeth. That is because we are omnivores. So evolutionarily, we eat plants and animals. Now, if you look at the teeth of maybe a cow, for example, they're going to have a lot of these flattened grinding teeth. But if you look at the teeth of a canine or a feline, you're going to see a sharper teeth here up front for ripping and tearing meat and flesh because they are carnivores. So that's kind of what the teeth look like here. I think there's one question on your homework about naming the types of teeth. Essentially, the easiest way to go about this is to start in the front. I always start with the front 2 and then go one more over. So the front 4 here are going to be your incisors. Then you have one cuspid on each side. Then you have 2 bicuspids on each side. Sometimes they're called premolars. And then we have 3 molars on each side, and that's per jaw. So this same order, the same number of teeth is mimicked on the top. One thing to know, and that's kind of interesting, is that if you have ever had your wisdom teeth removed, that's actually your 3rd molar. So if you've had those removed, you are missing your 3rd molar. But the front 4 here are your incisors. Then you have 1 cuspid on each side, 2 bicuspids on each side, and then 3 molars on each side. All right, so we have chewed the food, and now we are preparing to swallow the food. Just to kind of review here, our pharynx. So when we talked about the pharynx with the respiratory tract, we started with the nasopharynx up here. Ideally, your food does not enter the nasopharynx. That's probably too high, right? So at the back of your nasal passages is where your nasopharynx was. Likely your food is going to first hit the oropharynx, which is at the back of the mouth here. This big structure is your tongue. So here's the mouth. We enter the mouth. Here's the food bolus, which is in green. And then here's your oropharynx here. Now, from there, we are traveling the pharynx to the laryngopharynx, which is going to be right in here, right before that split. Here's your trachea, here's your esophagus. Because we're talking about the digestive tract, we want to go down the esophagus. So what happens then? The epiglottis has to close over the trachea so that food does not enter our airway. So here's your food mass here. Our tongue pushes it to the back, back towards our oropharynx. And then we have a lot of muscles. Your book goes into a lot more detail about this, but there's a lot of constrictor muscles back here that are going to squeeze and push this food bolus down the pharynx. As that happens, your epiglottis is going to close over your trachea. And then that food is going to be forced into the esophagus. Now, the esophagus is made up of different areas of control. So you can control parts of it, you can't control other parts of it. This initial swallowing action though here in the pharynx, you have complete control over. And so that is going to be voluntary. Once we move down the esophagus though, we are going to become involuntary. So here's your esophagus. It goes clear down the back of your mouth, down your neck, down your chest, your thorax, and then it'll meet the stomach. If you were to remove this liver here, you would see the entirety of the stomach here. And then you can kind of see the pancreas. That's just showing that the pancreas is behind the stomach. But the esophagus leads into the stomach, which just sits just right below your breast region. Recall that the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. Remember that the trachea has a lot of cartilage that holds its structure. The esophagus is made up mostly of smooth muscle. And so it is a very tiny tube, but it can expand, it can stretch to accommodate that swallowing action. Whereas remember, the trachea holds its shape, holds its opening very in a sturdy fashion. So the esophagus has to come down here. Now, the one thing that it's going to run into, a muscle that sits right here, which is your diaphragm. So the esophagus actually goes through your diaphragm, through a hole that's called the esophageal hiatus. So the esophagus is going to go through a hole in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. That's going to lead to the stomach. Now, the very beginning of the esophagus, right after the pharynx, that's all going to be a voluntary area. So you can control the initial swallowing mechanism. As you move down the esophagus, now it's going to be involuntary, and that peristalsis action is going to take over, where that smooth muscle is going to do wave-like contractions to push that food bolus where it needs to go, and then it'll enter the stomach. The portion here where the esophagus enters the stomach, there is a sphincter there. And if you're not sure what a sphincter is, it's like a muscular opening that when it's closed, it kind of looks like this, and then it'll open like this, and then it'll close, and then it'll open, and it's controlled by smooth muscle. So the one that sits between the esophagus and the stomach that allows things to pass through that is going to be called the lower esophageal sphincter. All right, now we are in the stomach, and the stomach's main job is going to be a lot of chemical digestion. Here in the stomach, we have all these folds here. You can see it's kind of wrinkly. Excuse me, those are called rugae. So those folds are called rugae. They just help with the churning action. If you were to look at those rugae under microscopy, you would see a lot of like mucus cells, a lot of secretory cells that are going to secrete a lot of chemicals to help digest the material. They are also designed for stretch receptors. So as the stomach fills, it stretches, and those wrinkles will kind of flatten out. And that tells the nervous system that the stomach is full. So basically your esophagus would be up here. So the food contents are going to enter through this sphincter here, which is going to be the opening here. That's called the lower esophageal sphincter. That opens and allows the food to pass into the stomach. What happens in the stomach then is gastric juices are released, which are mostly made up of enzymes and hydrochloric acid, some mucus. And once the food bolus mixes with that gastric juice, then we call it chyme. It's a substance called chyme. So this is the majority of digestion here. In the stomach, we also have the beginning of the digestion of protein. There's an enzyme that does that. We'll talk about that in the physiology lecture. The stomach is very muscular. And so you can see in these two images down here, the muscle fibers go different directions. The outermost muscle layer runs along the curve of the stomach here. So the length of the stomach, that's called longitudinal muscle. So the muscle that has these long fibers that runs with the length, that's longitudinal. These fibers here that appear to go kind of around the stomach in circumference is called circular muscle. And then if we peel back those two layers, then we have some diagonal muscle fibers here that are called oblique fibers. So you can imagine, so if your stomach is sitting, and we'll put it here, Those longitudinal fibers are going to squeeze the stomach this way. Okay. The circular muscle is going to squeeze the stomach from this direction, and the oblique is going to kind of mix it from an angle. That way, those food contents get mixed as much as possible from kind of all different directions. A couple other anatomical terms. The beginning of the stomach here is called the cardia region, and the end of the stomach down here is called the pylorus. So this is just the proximal area of the stomach. This is the distal area of the stomach. Now, there's also a sphincter here that allows contents to exit the stomach because the direction of movement is going to be going this direction. So next would be the small intestine here. And so this is called the pyloric sphincter. So we have the lower esophageal sphincter up here that allows things to enter from the esophagus. We have the pyloric sphincter that allows the chyme to exit the stomach. Now, once food contents are in the stomach and the stomach is performing digestion, both of these sphincters are closed. That way, the food contents don't go back up through the esophagus, and they also don't exit too soon. I like to think of that as like a car wash. So when you enter the car wash, both doors close, the machines wash your car, and then the distal door opens to allow you to exit, right? So that's kind of what I like to think of. You'll see some curvatures here. Here's your lesser curvature. Here's your greater curvature out here. As far as anatomy goes, I think that's about all I need you to know about the stomach here. All right, so now we're going to move into the small intestine. When you see the intestines here, you see this jumbled mess right here in the middle. Then you see this kind of bigger structure along the outside. So the center pink structures that's all small intestine. This out here, this kind of brownish color, that's all large intestine. So we're going to stick in the small intestine here first. The stomach is here. It's going to join up with some small intestine. It goes behind this portion of the large intestine. And there's 3 segments of the small intestine, and they're all kind of folded up together. You actually cannot really tell the difference from the outside of the small intestine between the 3 segments. You would have to go in there with a scope, and there's different anatomical and histological differences that you can tell the difference between the sections. But essentially what happens after you leave the stomach, then we enter the duodenum. The duodenum is the shortest. It's only about 12 inches. Then this general area up here is going to be all jejunum. That's the middle section. And then this area down here is going to be ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine. The ileum will meet up with the large intestine, and then the next part of the alimentary canal will come. On the superficial part of this area here, this is all called omentum. It's a fatty, like it looks like an apron. It's a fatty structure. Basically, it suspends from the stomach here. So from that greater curvature of the stomach, there's this fatty like apron that's going to hang down here over the intestines. There's a lot of, like, there's some protective quality there. There's also a lot of blood vessels and nerves that go through that omentum. In between these portions of the intestines, here's a good picture here. This is all called mesentery. And this mesentery is going to help kind of fold up the portions of the small intestine. Also, again, blood vessels and nerves are going to pass through there to deliver blood supply to all parts of the small intestine. So it's kind of like a net, like a webbing that is going to sit between the small intestine. So that's called mesentery. If you can recall from the blood vessel section, remember we had the mesenteric vessels, the superior and inferior mesenteric. Those will branch off into these little vessels here that eventually are going to feed the intestine. All right. The small intestine does very, very little, if any, digestion, but it does the majority of the absorption. So hopefully by this point, when you're in the small intestine, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 things, everything's going to be broken down into its simplest form that can then be absorbed. So your amino acids, your vitamins, your minerals, all of those things should hopefully be in their simplest form so that the small intestine, all it has to do is just absorb those things into the bloodstream. Now, the next portion of the digestive tract is going to happen right here. So there's a portion, if we were to stretch out this small intestine, the end of the small intestine, the ileum, will meet up with this beginning of the large intestine. Here's a good picture right here. So here's the terminal ileum that's going to join up with the large intestine here. There's a sphincter there, of course, that has to open to allow the contents to move through there. It's called the ileocecal sphincter. Not labeled on here, but we'll get to that. All throughout the small intestine here, if we were to look at the wall, if we were to cut it and look at the wall, we would see a bunch of these little finger-like projections out here. So you can kind of see these are all microvilli, but there's also these larger villi that are going to be there as well. This, let's see, yeah, this is just a single cell, but a bunch of these cells make up one of these villi. So you can see the perimeter here. If we were to zoom in on one of these yellow cells right here, we would be looking at this. So you can see that there's this teeny tiny little villi, microvilli at the edges of all of these cells, but then a bunch of those cells make up another projection called a villus. Villus is singular. The importance of the villi. Okay, so if you extend something out into an environment, now we have maximized the surface area that can touch contents to be absorbed. Notice how in each of these villi, there is a capillary network, blood vessels, and then there's also this lymphatic vessel called a lacteal. If you remember that term from the lymphatic system, that's called a lacteal. So all of those contents are moving through the small intestine, right? And these blood vessels can quickly absorb nutrients across that membrane, that plasma membrane, into the capillary network, into the bloodstream. Lacteals are important for absorbing dietary fats, and we'll talk about the digestion of fats in part 2. But just know that the lacteals absorb lipids that have not been absorbed up until this point, and so that's what that's for. Yeah, basically the purpose here of all these villi and microvilli is to just increase the surface area for absorption of nutrients. And that's if we were to look inside this lumen, the lining of this lumen. All right, so the ileum enters into the beginnings of the large intestine. Here's that entry point here. That's where your ileocecal sphincter is located. Then we are going to go through the different portions of the colon here in just a second, but the purpose of the large intestine is mostly to absorb water and electrolytes. No absorption happens in the large intestines because there's no villi there. There's no villi or microvilli in the large intestine. Mainly water and electrolytes get absorbed via like diffusion and osmosis. The other main purpose of the colon is to store and form feces, which is waste product of digestion. We start with the cecum. So the cecum is this very beginning part, and off of the cecum hangs the appendix. So if some of you still have your appendix, that's where it's located. Then the colon goes in this direction. This would be your lower right, up across the midsection, and then down the left side of your abdomen, and then out. Your rectum is going to be this kind of straight portion of the colon. By the way, colon is the same thing as a large intestine. Some people don't realize that means the same thing. And then your anal canal is going to be where that narrows down here. There are 2 sphincters that control your bowel movements. We'll talk about that more in physiology. But essentially, you have an internal anal sphincter and then you have an external anal sphincter. Those 2 sphincters are very important in terms of how bowel movements occur. There's going to be a similar sphincter setup when we get to the urinary system coming out of the bladder as well. And then you can see this mesentery here again, kind of suspending blood vessels and things to feed all the areas of the colon. So here's the appendixes off the cecum. Here's your cecum. As we move through the large intestine, we're going to go up. This is the ascending colon. We're going to take a turn, and this is called the right colic flexure. Flexure means turn. Some texts also call it the hepatic flexure, which is called that for the liver. The liver sits right here. So we go up the ascending colon around the right colic flexure. We go across the transverse colon. Transverse means kind of linear, across horizontally. And then we go the left colic flexure, which is also called the splenic flexure because the spleen sits over here. We go down the descending colon. We come around and we go through the sigmoid colon. That's going to be kind of this little segment right here. And then we'll hit rectum and anal area here. And that's how things move through the large intestine. Peristalsis, right? So peristalsis happens in the colon about 2 to 3 times a day. That's the average number of bowel movements that somebody might have. Obviously, people have more or less than that. But essentially, there's going to be the squeezing action happen. So we might have a contraction here, and that's going to move feces this way. And then we might have a contraction, here, and it's moving, and then it gets down here. Once it pushes into the rectum, that's when you start to have that urge to have a bowel movement. Feces are basically made up of non-digested and non-absorbed material. So anything that's like waste product, a lot of plant products are excreted in feces because humans don't have the proper enzymes to digest cellulose, which is a component of a plant cell wall. Water and electrolytes are in the feces as well. And then mucus helps kind of lubricate it to move throughout the large intestine. Of course, dead cells of the wall of the intestine are going to be sloughed off there, and then some bacteria as well. Your large intestine is full of bacteria, good and bad bacteria, that helps with digestion and maintaining a healthy colon. The odor of feces comes from basically the action of bacteria, kind of synthesizing those wastes, all the byproducts of what they're doing in there. One of the major byproducts is sulfur, and sulfur is very smelly. All right, so that wraps up part 1. In part 2, we are going to go over the accessory organs.